Welcome to another deep dive. I'm really excited about today's topic. We're going to be exploring something so fundamental to all of us. It's how we see ourselves.
Self-concept.
Yes, but we're not just talking about those general feel-good vibes of self-esteem. We're diving deep into the nitty-gritty, the fascinating world of research that's trying to unpack how we perceive ourselves. And not just as one big feeling, but across all the different parts of our lives.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at a significant body of research, particularly the work of Herbert Marsh and his colleagues.
Right, Maestro. He's done some really influential work in this area. And specifically, we're going to be focusing on a 1990 review paper he published. It's a kind of a landmark synthesis of years and years of research on self-concept, how we measure it, how it develops, and how it's structured. It's kind of a deep dive into a deep dive.
It is. And it's going to really help us move beyond the simplistic ideas of, do I feel good about myself? Or do I feel bad about myself? It's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, way more complex. And that's what we're here to uncover today. Some really surprising insights into how you see yourself in all these different areas of life.
I think a good place to start might be to consider just how murky our understanding of self-concept used to be. If you look back at the research before the 1980s, it was a pretty skeptical landscape.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, those early studies, they often lacked that strong theoretical foundation,
Yeah.
And the ways they tried to measure self-concept were often kind of shaky.
Exactly. The methodologies were questionable, and to be honest, a lot of the studies just didn't find anything particularly consistent or meaningful.
Which makes sense. If you're not even sure what you're measuring, how can you get solid results, right?
Right. And this lack of clear results led some researchers to wonder, is self-concept even a useful thing to study? Like, does this idea even hold water in psychology?
So it was a real crisis of confidence in the whole concept.
It was. And part of the problem was that the research was happening kind of all over the place without a central discipline to guide it, so it was really fragmented.
So it was like everybody was trying to build their own little piece of the puzzle without a picture on the box to guide them.
Exactly. And the questionnaires they were using to measure self-concept back then, often just a hodgepodge of different items, no real conceptual clarity.
Okay, so if you're trying to measure something as complex as self-concept with a tool that's not well designed, you're bound to get mixed up results. It's like using a butter knife to chop wood.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what was happening. When researchers tried to analyze this data, the different supposed aspects of self-concept would just kind of blur together, overwhelmed by this general sense of self-worth.
So it's like you ask someone how they feel about their looks, their smarts, their social life, and it all just gets filtered through this one lens of, do I generally like myself or not?
Precisely. It made it almost impossible to really tease apart the specific components of self-concept. And statistical techniques like factor analysis, which are designed to help identify underlying dimensions, well, they often gave results that were super hard to interpret, inconsistent, messy.
So the methods weren't powerful enough to pick up on those subtle distinctions between different aspects of self-concept.
Exactly. And then you add to that the question of whether children can even make those kinds of nuanced judgments about their worth in different areas. Some argued that maybe they just weren't developmentally ready.
So it's like trying to tune a radio to a specific frequency, but all you get is static, and you're not even sure if the signal is even there.
Right. But then something shifted. The 1980s saw this crucial turning point in the research.
Yeah, tell me about that shift. What changed the game?
It was a growing understanding that self-concept wasn't this big, undifferentiated blob. Researchers began to realize, hey, maybe it's actually got different parts.
Multiple dimensions,
Yeah.
like facets of a jewel.
Yes, precisely. It was this crucial move towards a more multifaceted view of self-concept, seeing it as a collection of distinct facets that all contribute to the overall picture.
And this was huge. This shift in perspective was really the key to finally unlocking those inconsistencies that had plagued all those earlier studies.
It really was.
So the key idea we're exploring today is that self-concept isn't just one score you get on a test. It's not just, do I like myself? It's way more nuanced than that. It's this mosaic of all these different self-views. It's about how you see yourself through all these different lenses.
Exactly. And to really understand yourself, you have to understand those different lenses. How do you see yourself academically, socially, physically? All these pieces matter.
And if you just rely on a global measure of self-concept, you miss all those important details. And you end up with, well, confusing and sometimes contradictory findings, like those earlier studies.
Exactly. And that's where Herbert Marsh's work comes in. His research was really instrumental in pushing forward this whole idea of multidimensionality.
Right. Marsh. Your sources really emphasize how important his contributions were. So tell me, how did he help move the field forward?
Well, Marsh was all about developing better ways to actually measure these different aspects of self-concept. And that led to the creation of something called the Self-Description Questionnaire, or SDQ for short.
The SDQ.
Hmm.
Okay, so this was a new tool, a new instrument designed to measure self-concept in a more refined way.
Yeah, and there were different versions of the SDQ tailored to different age groups. You had one for pre-adolescents, one for adolescents, and one for young adults because, how we see ourselves changes as we grow and develop.
Makes sense. So what was the main goal of the SDQ? What was Marsh trying to achieve?
The fundamental aim was to give researchers a reliable and valid tool, something they could use to really rigorously test these more complex models of self-concept.
So it wasn't just about asking vague questions. It was about getting to the heart of these different facets.
Right. And the specific scales within the SDQ, well, they were carefully crafted to tap into distinct areas, like your perceived physical abilities, your appearance, your relationships with your peers, your competence in specific academic subjects like math or reading.
Okay, so the SDQ is this carefully designed instrument, engineered to reveal all these different facets of self-concept that earlier research had just kind of lumped together. But this idea of a multifaceted self-concept didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like Marsh just woke up one day and said, aha,
Yeah.
it's multidimensional.
Right. There was some crucial foundational work that laid the groundwork.
Like whose work?
Well, there's this landmark paper by Shavelson and his colleagues. It came out in 1976, and it proposed this model of self-concept, a model that was not only multifaceted, but also hierarchical.
Multifaceted ND hierarchical. Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So first of all, it proposed that your self-perceptions are organized. They're made up of all these different aspects that we've been talking about. You've got your social self, your physical self, your academic self, and so on.
Okay, so that's the multifaceted part. But what about this hierarchy? How does that fit in?
The hierarchical part is the idea that those different facets are organized into levels. You start with these specific behaviors and experiences, the nitty-gritty of your daily life.
Like, I aced that math test, or I tripped and fell in the cafeteria.
Exactly. And those experiences then feed into your broader self-perceptions in specific areas. So a bunch of positive experiences in math class might lead you to see yourself as good at math.
And all those domain-specific self-perceptions, like feeling good at math, or good at sports, or good at making friends, they then contribute to your overall sense of self-worth at the top of the pyramid.
You got it. It's like building blocks. Specific behaviors at the bottom, then more general self-views in different areas, and then finally your overall sense of self.
Okay, I'm starting to see the structure here. So Shavelson's model was suggesting that it's all interconnected.
Exactly. But there's more. They also made some other interesting points, like the more specific the area of self-concept, the more tied it is to particular situations.
So your self-concept for playing basketball might be very different from your self-concept for giving a presentation in class.
Precisely. And they suggested that as people mature, their self-concept becomes even more multifaceted.
So as you get older, you start to see yourself through even more lenses.
Right. And they also made a clear distinction between the descriptive aspect of self-concept and the evaluative aspect.
What's the difference?
Well, descriptive is just about the facts. I'm good at writing. Evaluative is about how you feel about it. I feel confident about my writing skills.
Okay, so one is about what you believe to be true about yourself, and the other is how those beliefs make you feel.
Exactly. And this is really important because it highlights that your actual abilities and your self-concept aren't always perfectly aligned. Just because you get good grades doesn't mean you feel confident about your academic abilities.
Right. It's like you can be objectively good at something but still feel like an imposter.
Precisely.
So Shavelos's model was pretty revolutionary. It offered this really rich framework for understanding self-concept. But you mentioned earlier that it didn't immediately get a ton of empirical support.
Yeah, the initial evidence to back it up was a little shaky.
Why was that?
Well, we have to remember the limitations of those early studies. Researchers were constantly bumping up against this issue, where all these supposed different aspects of self-concept just seem to be so heavily influenced by an individual's general feeling of worth.
So it was like that overall self-esteem was just so powerful that it was drowning out all the subtleties of the different areas.
Exactly, like a loud noise that makes it impossible to hear a quiet conversation.
So Shavelson and his colleagues presented this amazing theory, But the tools and methods at the time just weren't there yet to fully test it.
Right. The statistical analyses they were using with those older questionnaires, they just didn't really line up with this multidimensional model. So even though the theory was compelling, the data wasn't quite there to support it.
Which is why a lot of researchers still clung to that idea that self-concept was primarily just one big thing, this single unified construct.
Exactly. And that's where Marsh's research using the SDQ comes in.
Ah, yes, the SDQ, the more refined tool. So did the SDQ data finally provide that missing validation for the multifaceted view?
It absolutely did. Marsh's work with the SDQ gave the strong, consistent evidence for the idea that self-concept is indeed multidimensional. And it backed up the claims that Shavelson's model was onto something really important.
So the data was finally starting to match the theory.
Right. When they analyzed the responses to the SDQ using those more sophisticated statistical methods, those different dimensions of self-concept just popped right out, clear as day. And this was a huge step forward because it confirmed that, yes, people really do see themselves in these distinct, separable ways.
And that's where we get to this really intriguing finding, right? The near zero correlation between math and verbal self-concepts. That's the one that really caught my eye.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it was a bit of a head-scratcher at first. One of the most unexpected findings from the SDQ research was this almost non-existent statistical relationship between a person's self-concept in math and their self-concept in verbal areas.
Which is surprising, right? Because usually if you're good at math, you're also pretty good at reading and writing. At least that's the stereotype.
And the data usually backs that up. Achievement in math and verbal domains often goes hand in hand. So you'd naturally think, okay, if someone feels confident about their math skills, they'll probably feel pretty good about their verbal skills too.
Right, it seems logical, but that's not what the SDQ data showed.
Nope, not at all. The data consistently showed that these two self-perceptions, math and verbal, were basically independent of each other. No connection.
So you could have someone who feels like a total math whiz, but stumbles over their words when they try to write an essay, or someone who can craft beautiful poetry but panics at the sight of a math equation. And those feelings wouldn't necessarily influence each other.
Precisely. Which is why this finding was so significant. It was one of the main things that led researchers to revise that original Shavelson model. They realized that the relationships between academic self-concepts and different subjects were more complicated than they initially thought.
Like, the pieces of the puzzle were there, but they didn't fit together in the way they expected.
And that's what ultimately led to the development of a new model called the Internal External Frame of Reference model, or IE model for short. This model was created to try to explain this seemingly contradictory finding that math and verbal self-concepts could be so unrelated despite academic achievements often being linked.
Okay, so the SDQ research, with its more refined measures, was really shaking things up. It showed that self-concept is multidimensional. But then this math-verbal finding suggested that the way those dimensions relate to each other, particularly in academics, might be more nuanced than a simple pyramid structure.
You got it. And researchers wanted to dig deeper into that. So they turned to a technique called confirmatory factor analysis. It's a way to statistically test how different variables relate to each other. And they wanted to see if the data really supported that hierarchical structure, especially within academics.
So they were testing that pyramid idea. Did it hold up?
Well, it kind of did, especially for academics. The analysis showed that self-perceptions in specific subjects, like algebra or geometry, did contribute to a broader sense of academic self-concept. So if you feel good about your algebra skills and your geometry skills, that's likely to make you feel more confident about your overall math abilities.
So that part of the hierarchy made sense. But what about the non-academic stuff? Did that fit as neatly?
That's where things got a bit trickier, especially when they tried to neatly separate physical and social factors into distinct, higher-order categories.
So like trying to draw a clear line between how you feel about your looks
Yeah.
and how you feel about your social life.
Exactly. The relationships there just weren't as clear-cut. They found that self-concepts related to physical ability and physical appearance were often connected. Which makes sense, right? How you feel about your body can influence how you feel about your physical skills.
Right, but their relationship with social self-concept was a bit more muddled.
Right. It wasn't always consistent or easy to define. Sometimes there was a connection, sometimes not. It depended on the specific aspects of social self-concept they were looking at.
So it seems like the academic aspects of how we see ourselves might fit into that pyramid structure more easily. While the non-academic side, it's a bit messier, more interconnected. How we feel about our looks, our social lives, our bodies, It all seems to blend together more.
That's a good way to put it.
Now, what about age and sex? Do our self-perceptions change as we get older? And are there differences between how males and females see themselves? That's always a fascinating topic.
It is. And the research on that is pretty revealing. Some earlier reviews of the literature, like the work of Wiley, had suggested that overall self-concept didn't really show any clear, consistent patterns across age.
So no clear trend of the older you get, the more confident you become.
Not necessarily. But then Marsh came along and did this really cool thing. He used the SDQ, remember, with its multiple dimensions. He used it to track self-concept across different age groups. And that revealed a much more nuanced picture.
Ah, so looking at the individual dimensions rather than just the overall picture revealed some interesting patterns?
Exactly. While overall self-concept might show this kind of U-shaped trajectory, going down a bit in pre-adolescence and then gradually rising throughout late adolescence and early adulthood, the specific dimensions had their own unique paths.
So different parts of our self-concept might be going up or down at different times in our lives.
Right, like self-concept related to physical appearance, that tends to decline more for girls during adolescence compared to boys.
Oh, yeah, that's not surprising. Adolescence can be a rough time for body image, especially for girls. There's so much pressure from society and the media.
For sure. And those societal expectations definitely play a role.
What about sex differences in general? Did the research find any consistent patterns there?
Yeah, actually it did. The SDQ studies consistently found significant differences between males and females on many of those self-concept scales. And often, these differences aligned with traditional gender stereotypes.
Okay, so what were some of the key findings? Did they match those common assumptions about how boys and girls see themselves?
Well, across different age groups, boys tended to report higher self-concepts in things like physical ability, appearance, and math, while girls tended to report higher self-concepts in verbal abilities, reading, and sometimes overall school self-concept.
So boys feeling more confident about their athletic skills and their looks, and girls feeling more confident about their language skills. It does sound like those classic stereotypes, unfortunately.
It does. But the interesting thing is that these sex differences were pretty stable across the ages they studied. They held true from pre-adolescence through early adulthood.
So those gendered perceptions of our strengths and weaknesses, they seem to get ingrained pretty early on and then just stick with us.
It seems that way, at least for most dimensions, except for, you guessed it, physical appearance. That's the one where the difference between boys and girls really widened during adolescence, which again points to those societal pressures and how they can impact our self-perceptions.
Right? It's like those societal messages about beauty standards and body image really start to kick in during adolescence, especially for girls.
It's a critical period, for sure. Now, there's another piece of Chavelson's model that's worth revisiting, the idea that our self-concept becomes more differentiated as we get older.
Oh, right. The idea that as we mature, we develop more distinct facets of our self-concept. Like, instead of just seeing yourself as good or bad at school, you start to differentiate between, say, good at math, but not so good at history.
Exactly. And some early data collected from pre-adolescents actually supported this idea. It seemed like they were starting to develop more distinct self-perceptions in those early years.
So as we move from childhood to early adolescence, we start to see ourselves in more complex ways, more like a mosaic than a single color.
That's the idea. But here's the catch. When they looked at older adolescents and young adults using the SDQ, they didn't see that trend continuing. The increase in differentiation kind of plateaued after those early years.
So we might start to see ourselves in more nuanced ways early on, but then that process doesn't just keep going indefinitely.
Right. And in fact, some measures of differentiation actually showed a decrease during adolescence and early adulthood.
Interesting. So maybe as we get older, instead of just adding more and more pieces to the mosaic, we start to integrate those pieces into a more holistic picture, that we start to see the forest for the trees, so to speak.
That's a really interesting interpretation. It suggests that our self-perceptions become more integrated as we mature.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about individual factors, but what about the role of our environment? How does the context we're in affect how we see ourselves?
That's a great question. And it leads us to a really fascinating phenomenon. The big fish, little pond effect?
Ah, yes, the BFLPE. I love
Oh.
that name. So catchy.
It is. And it has some really important implications for how we think about self-concept.
So explain the BFLPE to me. What does it say about the impact of our environment on how we see ourselves?
Basically, it says that two students with the same level of academic ability, let's say they're both equally smart, they might have completely different academic self-concepts depending on the school they go to.
Okay, so Their actual abilities are the same, but their self-perceptions can be totally different depending on their school environment.
Exactly. If you're a bright student in a school full of other super high-achieving students, you're a small fish in a big pond. And you're constantly comparing yourself to all these other brilliant minds.
So even though you're smart, you might start to feel less confident, less capable, because everyone around you seems even smarter.
Right. But if you're that same bright student in a school where the average achievement level is lower, well, now you're a big fish in a small pond, and you're likely to stand out.
So suddenly you feel more confident, more capable, even though your actual abilities haven't changed at all, just the context has changed.
Exactly. And this effect is largely attributed to social comparison. We're constantly evaluating ourselves in relation to those around us.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
We're social creatures, so of course our perceptions are influenced by our social environments.
Absolutely. And this isn't just some theoretical idea. Researchers have actually tested the BFLPE using large-scale data sets, like the High School and Beyond study, and their findings supported the effect.
So it's not just a feeling, it's backed up by data.
It is. And it showed that going to a higher achieving school could actually negatively impact a student's academic self-concept, even when their actual academic abilities were taken into account.
Wow, so the context, the environment you're in, can have this powerful and sometimes unexpected effect on how you see yourself.
Exactly. And it can even influence the courses you choose to take, your educational aspirations, even your career goals down the line. It's pretty significant.
It is. It really highlights the importance of considering the environment when we're trying to understand self-concept. Now, can we go back to that math and verbal self-concept puzzle for a second? You mentioned that IE model earlier. How does that model try to explain why those two self-perceptions could be so disconnected?
Sure. So the internal-external frame of reference model proposes that we form our academic self-concepts through two different types of comparisons.
Okay, two types of comparisons. What are they?
The first is external comparison, which is what we were just talking about with the BFLPE. You're comparing your abilities to those of your peers. So you might be thinking, am I better or worse at math than the other kids in my class?
Right. That's how we typically think about competition and achievement.
But the IE model also adds this other layer, internal comparison. This is where you're comparing your abilities in one subject to your abilities in another subject. So you might be thinking, am I better at math or English?
So even if you're good at both subjects overall, you might still perceive yourself as being significantly better at one compared to the other.
Mhm.
Like maybe you consistently get A's in both math and English, but you just feel more naturally gifted in math.
Exactly. And the IE model suggests that having a perceived strength in one area through this internal comparison process can actually lead to a lower self-perception in another area, even if you're objectively good at both.
Okay, so it's like this internal balancing act. If you see yourself as really excelling in math, that might make your English skills seem less impressive in comparison, even if they're still good, which would then lead to a lower verbal self-concept.
That's the idea. It helps explain why we see that near zero correlation between those two areas, even though, like you said, achievement in math and verbal skills often go together.
It's fascinating how our own internal comparisons can shape how we see ourselves, sometimes even more than our comparisons to others. It's like we're constantly judging ourselves against our own internal standards.
It's a powerful force. It shows that self-concept is not just about how we stack up against others, but also about how we perceive our own relative strengths and weaknesses across different areas of our lives.
Okay, so we've talked about how we see ourselves, how our environment influences that, and how our own internal comparisons play a role. Now, what about the perceptions of others? How accurately can other people judge our self-concept?
That's an interesting question, and it turns out it's not as straightforward as you might think. Earlier research on this, using those more global measures of self-concept, often found that agreement between self-perceptions and how others perceived individuals was pretty weak.
So like, I might think I'm a great artist, but my friends might not see it that way.
Exactly. But then researchers started using those more detailed measures from the SDQ, remember, with those specific dimensions, and they started getting some more interesting results, especially when they involved ratings from people who knew the individuals well, like teachers, peers, and parents. The agreement between self-perceptions and others' perceptions was much higher when they used the SDQ.
So the more specific the measure, the more likely others are to see us the way we see ourselves.
Right. And it makes sense. The more easily observable a particular aspect of self-concept is, the easier it is for others to accurately perceive it.
So if I'm always participating in class and acing my math tests, It's pretty obvious to my teacher that I think I'm good at math. But if I'm struggling with self-doubt or feeling insecure about my social skills, that might be harder for others to pick up on.
Exactly. And there was another interesting pattern they found. Agreement on general self-concept, that overall sense of worth, tended to be lower than agreement on specific dimensions.
So it's easier for others to judge our specific abilities or traits, but harder for them to gauge our overall feelings about ourselves.
It seems that way. Those more abstract internal feelings are just tougher for others to see.
Okay, that makes sense. Now there's one more connection I want to explore. The link between our self-concept and how we explain our successes and failures.
Ah, you're talking about attributions, how we attribute the causes of events, especially our own successes and failures.
Yes, that's it. So how does self-concept relate to those attributions?
Well, the research shows that people with a more positive self-concept tend to have a specific pattern of attributions. They're more likely to attribute their successes to internal factors, things like their own ability and effort.
So if I do well on a test, I'm more likely to say I aced it because I'm smart and I studied hard, rather than I just got lucky or the test was easy.
Right. And they're less likely to attribute their failures to a lack of ability. So if they do poorly on a test, they might say, I didn't study enough or I wasn't feeling well that day, rather than I'm just not good at this subject.
So they're taking ownership of their successes and explaining their failures in a way that doesn't damage their self-perception.
Exactly. And this pattern was often specific to the academic domain. So, for example, someone with a high math self-concept would be more likely to attribute their good math grades to their math abilities, while someone with a lower math self-concept might attribute those same grades to external factors.
It shows how our self-perceptions can shape how we interpret the world around us. If we see ourselves as capable, we're more likely to see our successes as evidence of that capability.
Right. Now, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about stability. How stable is our self-concept over time? Is it constantly fluctuating, or is there a degree of consistency to how we see ourselves?
That's a big question. I mean, we all have good days and bad days. Sometimes we feel more confident, sometimes less so. But is there a core sense of self that remains relatively stable?
That's what the research suggests. Studies that have tracked self-concept over time have generally found it to be pretty stable, even in kids as young as pre-adolescence.
So even though we might have ups and downs, there's an underlying sense of who we are that tends to stay fairly consistent.
Exactly. But here's where things get interesting. When changes in self-concept do happen, they tend to be systematic and multidimensional.
What does that mean?
It means that if something happens that impacts your self-concept, it's likely to affect specific dimensions rather than just shifting your overall self-esteem up or down.
Okay, so let's say someone goes through a really successful experience in their art class. They create a piece of art that they're really proud of, and they get a lot of praise for it. Their self-concept related to their artistic abilities might go up. But that doesn't mean their self-concept related to their athletic abilities or social skills will also automatically increase.
Exactly. The changes are likely to be specific to the area that was impacted.
Which is why it's so important to remember that self-concept is multifaceted. It's not just one big global thing, it's this collection of different self-views.
Right. And this has really important implications for intervention programs. A lot of programs aimed at improving people's lives, especially in education, often target self-concept as an outcome.
Like, if we can boost students' self-esteem, they'll be more successful overall,
That's
right?
the thinking. But a lot of these programs, especially those that rely on those general measures of self-concept, haven't been very effective. They haven't really shown significant changes.
So trying to just boost overall self-esteem might not be the most effective strategy.
It might not be. But here's the thing. Studies that have used the SDQ with its specific dimensions have shown that targeted interventions can actually be quite effective.
So instead of trying to change everything at once,
Yeah,
focus on specific areas.
exactly. If you want to improve someone's math self-concept, you need to target their math skills. If you want to improve their social self-concept, you need to target their social skills.
And it's like you need the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
A hammer is great for pounding nails, but it's not going to help you fix a leaky faucet.
Perfect analogy. And there was this one study that really drove this point home. It showed that even when people's physical fitness improved, their physical ability self-concept didn't necessarily go up.
Wait, what? How is that possible?
It depended on the type of training they did. If the training emphasized competition, their self-concept was more likely to go down, even if they got physically fitter.
Because they were constantly comparing themselves to others and feeling like they weren't good enough.
Exactly, but if the training emphasized cooperation, then their self-concept was more likely to go up, even if they didn't improve as much physically.
Wow. So even if you're objectively getting better at something, if the environment emphasizes comparison and competition, it can actually damage your self-perception.
It can. It all comes back to that internal frame of reference, how we evaluate ourselves in relation to others and to our own internal standards.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Can you sum it all up for our listeners? What are the key takeaways from all this research on self-concept?
Sure. First and foremost, remember that self-concept.